Good on you, Tony. Thank you very much. Pretty good pass rates on those exams. You must be making it too easy. We have one more topic to deep dive into before we wrap things up and break for lunch. Folks, we've talked a little bit about atmospheric contaminants a little bit throughout our discussions this morning, particularly around silica, but we're going to spend a little bit more time getting into that topic. So would you please welcome up to the stage our final guest speaker for today, and that is Paul Foley, Inspector of Mines and Team Leader at Statewide Health WorkSafe WA. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Tim. Obviously, my web page is not nearly as important as yours because I couldn't find anything about you, but there's all questions about are you married, do you have kids, where do you live, and all that sort of thing. First of all, I'll start off by saying I am a scientist, and to quote another scientist, Neil deGrasse, quite a well-known physicist, he said, "The good thing about science, whether you believe it or not, it's the truth. So what I'm about to put up here is the truth. If you don't believe in it, then that's okay. But hopefully I'll put up some facts and figures. There's a lot of stuff about to come up on the screen, and when you get your slide packs, you can digest that at the appropriate time. Right, I suppose the first thing is changes to exposure standards. With the legislation, we've gone from exposure standards to exposure limits. Now, it sounds a little bit, subtle, but a limit is an absolute. So in the past, we had standards, which were basically levels that were indicative of the level that would protect the majority of the workforce. Now we've gone to limits, and they've been set on the no observable effect in the community. And that's a big difference. Now, I'm pretty sure, like everyone here, I'm sure I saw a memo that says we're not allowed to employ children in mines anymore. I'm pretty sure about that. Yes, I'm seeing some nods of heads. But there's a big difference between protecting children and the elderly and the most sensitive as opposed to workers. There's 9 priority substances at the moment that have been identified, and I'm going to talk about a few of them that I think are most relevant, and if you want to talk about some of the others, I'm happy to do that over a sandwich, or we can tee up and catch up in the office later on. Without getting into the absolute numbers, they are massive changes, massive reductions, and they will have massive implications on your operations and other operations. And I will say, and these proposed standards or these proposed limits have not been proposed by us at a state level, they've been proposed by Safe Work Australia. So the first thing that I'll talk about is silica. It's not a mining operation, I don't think, that doesn't have some sort of potential silica exposure. So I think to understand the future, we have to look at the past. Now, there's a few people here with more grey hair than me, but if we understand the past, we'll understand where we're going. So in the 1970s and 80s, basically there was a couple of mines inspectors, and they would get in their four-wheel drive, and they would spend a couple of weeks going from site to site, taking a couple of samples here and a couple of samples there. Probably wasn't very effective in terms of, to quote Dwayne, bang for your buck, but I suppose if you're an inspector, it was a way to see the state. In the early 80s, we changed to what was called the contam system, and that was really a watershed change, because what happened is we formalised the requirements for registered samplers. In other words, people had to go and do some training and be competent to collect the samples correctly. We formalised approved sampling methods, registered laboratories, and there was a whole lot of standardised job descriptions and job codes. And again, Dwayne talked earlier about having quality data So from our perspective, from the mid-1980s onwards, the department holds what's seen as very good quality data. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. The downside of that was it was a quota. So the mines inspector, or the district inspector as it was called in those days, would go to a site and say, you need to collect 20 samples, you need to collect 10, you need to collect 50, without really defining too much. So what tended to happen, some of that early data, supervisors, receptionists, weighbridge operators, the people that are easy to get. In the 2010s, it evolved to more risk-based process, but I will say it was still a monitoring plan or a monitoring program. And then in 2017, when I joined, we made some fairly fundamental changes to how health and hygiene was managed with the introduction of health management plans, and that was the change from having a monitoring plan to a management plan has been quite fundamental. It is interesting that we're collecting more samples than ever, and we're collecting more high-risk samples, but as we'll see later on, the percentage of exceedances are gradually trending downwards. For the management people here, you know, there is that saying, you know, what gets measured gets done. Step forward to 2022, introduction of the WHS legislation. Fundamentally, nothing changed. In 2017, we knew what was going to be in the regulations, so the requirements were there. Probably the only thing for your health management plans, which is an essential part of your mine safety management system, as well as looking at just agents, you need to include some of those other things like heat stress and psychosocial hazards and fatigue as a chronic hazard. We also have the ability in 2022 to submit health monitoring reports. This is where the person is examined by a registered medical practitioner. And I was talking to someone earlier, former colleague, Jamie, wherever he is, he said the biggest improvement he's noticed is that linking of the medical surveillance and the health surveillance program and the exposure monitoring programs in improving people's health. So, where do we sit? We arguably have, and no one's been able to challenge me yet, and I do sit on a number of national and international committees. In WA, we have probably the largest worker exposure database in the world, nearly nudging 1 million samples. And if we talk about silica, we have over 145,000 personal silica samples. What I will say is there's about 600 a month added, and industry, you guys are probably running at about 96% compliance. Now, in general terms, I know theoretically we would like 100% compliance, but generally when you get above 95% compliance, that's commonly known as the compliance statistic. So when you've got more than 95% compliance with a standard, that generally means that you have that situation or that event under control. If we go back to exposure standards of the day, obviously silica standards have come down. It's bumping up around 6%. I will say so, and then you can see the increase in the samples that are being collected, but the percentage of exceedances has actually gone down slightly. So then we look at some of the deep diving. From 2018 onwards, I will say, as an industry, the industry has increased its focus on increasing worker awareness and improving controls. There's some sites that I have had to visit several times, and there's others that are very good. I will say 2021 there was a campaign by the Mines Inspectorate that resulted in the reduction of the standard was halved. And as I said, despite more samples from high risk groups, the number of exceedances is not trending upwards. So then we'll have a look. So if you like, exposures are by and large controlled. There are a few areas I will say for attention: primary crushing and screening operations, exploration drilling, and laboratory sample prep are the three areas. So if you only get one takeaway out of this presentation, go back to your operations and have a look at dust controls in those areas. So then we have a look at mine worker disease. If we go back up to the late 70s, there was 50 to 100 silicosis cases per year in WA. Hence why you saw those changes happen in the 1980s. Since 1980, there's been very few cases of silicosis, and most of those are relating to underground gold miners who commenced employment prior to the 1980s. When we have a look at the work cover data, there's been 29 claimants regarding silicosis, 17 from the benchtop industry. Now, I don't have the exact numbers, but I would suggest that industry cannot be more than 200 or 300 people. So to have 17 cases in that very small cohort is absolutely unacceptable. 8 of the people have worked in the mining industry. One case has been accepted as mine related, and it does relate to his exposure prior to 75. I did meet that gentleman several times. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of months ago. There are a couple of other cases that are likely to be associated with mining, and one has been rejected as it was found to be asymptomatic tuberculosis, which radiographically looks kind of similar, but the person had worked in Asia for about a decade. And the other cases involved non-mining trades like stonemasons and what have you. So what I would say, we get rid of the first myth. We do not have tens or hundreds of cases of silicosis in the WA mining industry. So we can come out. So in 2017 there was an independent review. It's been published in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine by Lynn Frisky and others out of the UWA, and basically they came to the conclusion that silicosis risks have virtually been eliminated in WA. This year there was a further review done by some enlightened people, Harmon Foley, a bit of a relative of mine, no, and Ralph, Martin Ralph, some of you would know, a former inspector, and we've come to the same conclusion that silicosis is virtually eliminated in WA mining, and that's published in the journal, the Occupational Medicine. Few people have challenged us on that and saying, yes, but what about all the cases that haven't been reported? So my colleague, Dr. Harmon, in our office, he's had a look at what's called the pharmacokinetic modelling. In other words, you have a look at the exposures, and we've taken some worst case situations, and the worst case parameters, 3,000 hours instead of 2,000 hours, which is kind of what you do if you do 2 weeks on, 1 week off. We've taken the worst of the worst exposures for, as I said, for drillers, lab people, and we've plugged that into these occupations. And you can see we kind of get a lung burden, between about, 200-300 up to sort of 500. The pharmacokinetic model says that you need at least 1,300 milligrams per lung to elicit disease. So we're very comfortable with our assessment that there are no hidden cases there, because it's only going to be those real outliers. Across the general industry, we're very comfortable that mine workers' exposures are not going to be sufficient to elicit disease. 2021, slight change. Went to low-dose CT scan, which is a much more precise radiographic technique, and we probably get about 5,000 or 6,000 health surveillance reports a year coming in, maybe a little more with a flurry. I would encourage you to make sure that you do have a robust health surveillance program. It will make sure that nobody slips through the gaps. The great thing about low-dose CT, there's good and bad. The bad is, unfortunately, it costs more than a conventional chest X-ray. But more importantly, what it allows is for the identification of any anomalies before people even have symptoms. And that's rather significant, because the other thing that we found is when you intervene with silica, unlike other dust diseases like asbestos and asbestos-related diseases, once you stop your exposure, very rarely does the conditions progress. So what we've been able to do is we've been able to intervene when the people have got no signs or symptoms. They've just got these little glassy nodules or some slight anomalies. We introduce, and the organisation has introduced really robust and controls, taking them out of dust exposure areas. And in fact, what we're finding when we come back and have a look 18 months, 2 years later, that person's anomaly has either disappeared or not progressed. So the great thing about using low-dose CT is you can intervene when the person doesn't have any symptoms, and if you get onto it early enough, you can intervene such that people their disease doesn't progress to more serious. This is just sort of the progression, and obviously we want to try and intervene if it occurs at the inflammation or the glass opacity stage, not once we end up with massive fibrosis. So what I'd say in conclusion for silica, based on historical data, we know that there's between 100 and 170,000 people on WA mine sites on any given day. When we have a look at the incidence of silicosis, it's exceedingly unlikely or low, somewhere in the lifetime risk of 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a million. A 1 in a million risk is pretty much the same as being struck by lightning. What I will say is further legislative burden will not resolve the very small risk from historical exposures. Silicosis will remain virtually eliminated for mine worker if industry continues compliance with current requirements and the regulator continues to enforce those requirements. As such, silica dust strategies for WA mines must continue to focus on both industry and worker awareness and regulatory enforcement for the few non-compliant mine operators. And I think we also should embrace the new diagnostic methods that can detect anomalies at an early stage. So that's silica. Diesel particulate. So this is more for the underground folk. We hold, again, large database, 23,000 DPM results submitted by yourself or collected by us. Currently, the standard that WA introduced, one of the first, well, the first in Australia and one of the first actually in the world, of 100 micrograms. Industry, you guys are doing quite well, 92% compliance. If the standard was dropped to 50 micrograms, which is what New South Wales and Queensland have adopted, about 70% would comply. The Safe Work Australia said that, and I'll talk about this, about 35 would be 62%. But if we get down to 15 micrograms per cubic metre, only 1.2% would comply. It's all very difficult talking about, what does X micrograms per cubic metre look like. So what I did a couple of weeks ago is took our instrument and went outside our office in Adelaide Terrace, and we had 3 to 4. I walked down the terrace, and when a bus went past or a ute went past, it was 12 to 15. Went to the bus port in Perth, the inside one, in the waiting lounge, and the levels were 10 to 40 in there. When the doors opened for you to get on the bus, the levels were 150 to 600. Inside the bus with the air conditioning on, where the passengers sit, this is not driver, driving inside the bus port, 30 to 50, and then as the bus was driving around the CBD, the levels were 20 to 30, and then when we got about 5 k's from the CBD, which is about where I live, coincidentally, the levels were about 15 to 20, and when I walked, my house is about 300 metres from a busy road, the levels dropped to 2 to 3. So, if we talk about, and there is a proposal from Safe Work Australia of 10. Now, I'm not sure, and I will say when I took these readings, there was no bad smells, there was no fog, there was no haze, there was nothing. You would say, this air's pretty clean. So I'm not, and we have the best buses that our taxpayer money pays for. We're not talking about, old black smoke billowing out of the bus type of arrangement. So I am very concerned for this industry. If we go down the path of 10 or 15, I'm actually not sure how the underground mining industry is going to comply. So my other takeaway is, if you're in that situation, I strongly recommend that you lobby your industry group and you lobby the various voices of your industry, because it will have a profound effect. The interesting thing is Safe Work Australia commissioned an independent report. It's called the SLR report. It was supposed to contain many state-of-the-knowledge information, but it often misquoted or misrepresented some of the original scientific paper, which is a little disturbing when you misquote as a scientist. It's sort of one of the no-nos. But when you pull out the subjective stuff and look at the pure science, it said that a level of 100 will protect almost everybody, including sensitive people such as asthmatics, from acute effects. Levels of 35 to 45 will protect workers from chronic effects. Levels below 35 are contradictory and unreliable, and there's no evidence of health effects at that level. Despite that, Safe Work the SLR report recommended 15. Not saying that there was any influence, but maybe. And then Safe Work Australia has proposed a 10 limit. It makes no sense, and it's even worse for our industry, because when that gets adjusted for a 12-hour shift, that means it's now 7. Exactly the same as walking down St George's Terrace on a fine day. I will say that my personal view, a limit in the 35 to 50 range will protect against ill health effects and is technically achievable by current technology. I will say the WA Commission is currently reviewing the proposed limits. Dare I say you need to be lobbying your representatives. And I sit on a national government occupational health regulators group, and some of the eastern states jurisdictions are probably going to reject the 10 or 15 proposal and stick with their 50. Last thing for cyanide. Our position is that we don't support the change. The current standard is a 10 parts per million peak, and the proposed standard is a 0.9 ppm time-weighted average over an 8-hour period. Again, makes no sense, and a 4.7 ppm STEL. It's not supported for a number of reasons. For those in the gold industry, cyanide is a fast-acting toxin. To have a standard, even a STEL, is a measurement averaged over a 15-minute period. That will not protect people. You want to be having your instantaneous reading that is not exceeded. So it is just bad science, and it lacks an understanding of the mechanisms and the toxicity of that substance. We've argued, and I'm arguing, and meeting next week in Sydney, standard practice in the gold industry should be fixed detectors and around the key areas, supplemented by personal alarms that people wear. We know in our industry here that safe work practices are well established. We know that if you use cyanide, you have to have a dangerous goods licence. We've had no fatalities from hydrogen cyanide inhalation below the current standard in the last 20 years. Unfortunately, we have had a few cases of intentional ingestion. There has been one case, I will say, from excessive inhalation and skin absorption on contaminated clothing. And there's been few ill health effects for cases with exposures and there's been a few ill health effect cases when people have exposed to 20 to 50. It will affect the gold industry. Show of hands, who's from gold? Tony, just have a look around when you go. Someone was asking me over a croissant this morning, there are 273 gold mines in WA, 36,000 mine workers work in that industry, contributing $21 billion to the economy. So it is not small cheese, and I get really annoyed when the people in Canberra said, there's going to be minimal regulatory impact. Again, lobby your respective organisations. All right. Thank you. Someone put, I had thank you questions, comments and complaints if we had time, but it looks like you've edited me out. Any of the complaints, they go to Paul Foley at parkbench.langley park, okay? Any positive things goes to Tony Robinson. Thank you.